By 1967, the M16 had officially replaced the M14 as the standard United States service rifle. In concept, the M16 was a true revolution. It was lighter. It fired 5.56mm ammunition. It allowed soldiers to carry more rounds, move faster, and fire on full automatic with a level of control the M14 had never been able to deliver. In the right configuration and with proper maintenance, it was an effective weapon. That phrase matters. Proper maintenance. Because the early M16 was not properly maintained, in part because the Army had told soldiers it did not need to be. Early procurement decisions removed the chrome lining from the chamber and barrel, the very protection that would have resisted corrosion in Vietnam's heat and humidity. The powder used in the original ammunition generated more fouling than the rifle's gas system could reliably handle. A cleaning kit, which should have been standard issue from the beginning, was not included. The Army had described the M16 as self-cleaning. It was not self-cleaning, and soldiers in the field learned that fact in the worst possible place, during firefights. The consequences were not rumor. They were documented in congressional testimony, in battlefield after-action reports, and in letters sent home by soldiers describing rifles that jammed in the middle of engagements. A Marine study in 1967 found jamming rates in combat that would have been unacceptable on any test range. The Army launched investigations. Those investigations confirmed the failures. The rifle was modified, chrome lining was added, powder was changed. Cleaning kits were finally issued. The worst of the problems were eventually reduced. But that resolution came only after men had already died trying to clear jams from rifles that had been sold to them as modern and superior replacements for what had come before. There is one detail from that period that captures exactly what had been lost. During the 1967 ICORD congressional hearings, the formal investigation Congress convened to determine why the M16 was getting men killed, investigators surveyed 1,585 troops who had carried the rifle in Vietnam. Approximately 80% of them reported experiencing stoppages in combat. That figure entered sworn congressional testimony and was not disputed. The men who had carried Garands through 2 wars and had never seen anything remotely close to that kind of failure rate did not need anyone to explain what it meant. They already had the explanation. In National Guard armories across the country, M1 Garands still sat in storage racks. In competitive shooting circles, the Garand was still winning matches because its trigger, its balance, and its inherent accuracy were not things time had made obsolete. Among the generation of veterans who had carried it into combat, the knowledge of what had been traded away, and what that trade had cost, remained a quiet but persistent fact. The Army's eventual reckoning with what the Garand represented did not come in a speech. It did not come in a ceremony. It came in the mechanical decisions built into every service rifle that followed. The failures of the M14 and the early M16 forced a sustained effort to understand what actually made a combat rifle reliable under the conditions soldiers really faced. Not on clean ranges, not in controlled tests, in jungles, in deserts, in Arctic cold, and the answers that came back looked, in fundamental ways, like John Garand's original work. Gas-operated actions with controlled timing, rotating bolts with positive lockup, tolerances designed for dirt and moisture in real environments rather than the polished precision of an armory. Chrome-lined barrels, reliable feed systems that worked in every temperature, in every orientation, in the hands of exhausted soldiers who had not slept in 3 days. These were not new ideas. They were ideas John Garand had built into his rifle in the late 1920s and validated through 15 years of development and 2 complete design restarts. The rifles that followed had to rediscover those lessons the hard way. Then, something else happened. The civilian marksmanship program, originally created to keep Americans proficient with military rifles, began distributing M1 Garands to qualified civilians. Those rifles were bought, maintained, competed with, and handed down. An entire economy grew around them: replacement parts, accurizing work, match ammunition, books devoted to their history. The rifle declared obsolete in 1957 became, 4 decades later, the center of an active community of shooters who understood something about it that the ordnance boards had never fully measured. In competitive shooting, the Garand's record was unmistakable. At Camp Perry, in the national championship matches, the M1 remained competitive against rifles designed decades later. Its trigger, its sight radius, and the inherent accuracy of the .30-06 cartridge at distance meant that a skilled shooter with a Garand could still hold his own against equipment costing 3 times as much and engineered with the benefit of everything learned since 1936. And outside competition, the rifle never truly disappeared. In ceremony, it stayed. Drill teams at military academies and across the service branches continued using the Garand because nothing that came after it had the same balance, the same weight, the same feel for precise manual of arms. The Army's old guard still carried it. The argument that the rifle was obsolete could not survive the fact that the institution itself kept finding reasons to keep it in hand. That is why the story of why American riflemen never gave up the M1 Garand is not a story about nostalgia. It is not about an older generation refusing to accept progress. The men who carried it through the Pacific, through Korea, through the cold and mud and darkness of 20th century combat, were not sentimentalists. They were the least sentimental evaluators of weapons imaginable. They had used those tools under conditions where the only metric that mattered was whether you made it home. What they knew, and what the decades after 1957 confirmed, was that the Garand had been built right. It had been engineered from first principles for the conditions soldiers actually faced, not the conditions testing ranges preferred to simulate. When the replacements struggled, the riflemen who had carried the Garand did not need a formal investigation to tell them why. They already knew. The M14 was better on paper. The early M16 was lighter and carried more rounds. But neither of those things turned out to be the whole argument. John Garand had spent 15 years and gone through 2 complete redesigns to build a rifle that would not fail when American soldiers needed it most. He succeeded so completely that the very failure mode his design had eliminated, the rifle that stopped working in the cold, in the mud, under sustained fire, had to be rediscovered by the generation that came after. And that rediscovery was expensive in the ways that matter most. The rifle left official service in 1957. It never left American hands. It remained in armories and competition ranges and drill halls and private collections. It remained in the muscle memory of a generation that had carried it into the worst places the 20th century produced. And when those men looked at what came after and found it wanting, they were not wrong. The investigations, the congressional hearings, the revised procurement decisions, all of them eventually pointed to the same conclusion the veterans had reached quietly, without drama, from the very beginning. The Army retired the M1 Garand. The men who had carried it into combat spent the rest of their lives proving that retirement had come too soon. There is a special kind of credibility that comes only from being right about something that cost other people dearly to rediscover. The veterans who had carried Garands through the Pacific and Korea then came home and watched the replacement cycle unfold over the next 2 decades, held that credibility without needing to advertise it. It showed up in the competitions they kept winning. In the armory racks, they refused to clear out. In the drill teams that kept reaching for the old rifle because nothing that came after it moved the same way. General Patton had called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not a man known for diplomatic overstatement. And the soldiers who had carried the Garand through 3 wars across 4 decades of American combat history, reached the same judgment by a far more direct route. It worked. It did not stop working. And everything that replaced it eventually had to find its way back to the principles Garand had built into it from the beginning. That is the real reason American riflemen never let the M1 Garand go. Not because they feared change, not because they worshipped the past, but because they had already seen what combat does to theory. They had already learned the brutal distance between an ordnance board conclusion and the truth discovered under fire. On paper, rifles can be replaced in a meeting room. In war, they are judged somewhere else. They are judged in frozen darkness, in jungle humidity, in mud, in panic, in exhaustion. In the split second when a man pulls the trigger and finds out whether the machine in his hands is worthy of his trust, the Garand earned that trust over and over again. It earned it in the Pacific against defenders fighting from coral and jungle fortifications under a doctrine that rejected surrender. It earned it in Europe where German infantry doctrine relied on machine gun suppression and still found itself cracked by the relentless volume of American semi-automatic rifle fire. It earned it in Korea, where Chinese and North Korean assaults came at night, through cold, so vicious it froze lubricants solid and turned lesser mechanisms into dead metal. The Garand kept firing. That memory did not disappear because a new rifle came along with a detachable 20-round magazine or a faster cyclic rate. And it did not disappear because officials declared the future had arrived. Veterans had already paid for their opinion with experience. They had no reason to surrender it simply because the paperwork had changed. That is why, even after 1957, the rifle's story did not end. It continued in the National Guard, in Allied formations trained by American advisors, in Republic of China units, in civilian marksmanship circles, at Camp Perry, in military ceremony, in the hands of shooters who understood that some designs outlive the era that officially produced them because they solved the real problem so completely. The future keeps circling back to them. The Garand was one of those designs. The Army could retire it from standard service. It could replace it on inventory charts. It could move it out of first-line issue. But it could not erase what the rifle had already proven. That is why the veterans never had to make speeches. They never had to launch campaigns. They never had to turn their judgment into a slogan. Time did that for them. Every M14 limitation in Vietnam, every early M16 stoppage, every investigation, every hearing, every correction made after men had already paid the price. All of it brought the same quiet verdict back into focus. The old rifle had been built right. And that is why the M1 Garand remained more than a weapon. It became a benchmark, a standard by which later rifles were measured, especially when those rifles failed in the one place that mattered most. Combat does not care what looked superior in a procurement briefing. It does not care what seemed efficient in peacetime doctrine. It reveals, very fast and very brutally, whether the thing you were handed can survive the environment, the pressure, the neglect, the fear, and the chaos that real war always brings. The Garand could. That was the truth the men who carried it understood in their bones. That was the truth the next generation had to relearn at terrible cost. And that is why the rifle never really disappeared, no matter what the paperwork said. Some things are given up on paper. Some things are never given up at all. The M1 Garand was one of them. If this is the kind of military history that matters to you, the kind built not on slogans but on what men learned under fire, stay with this story and keep going deeper, because the weapons that last are never just the ones that looked best when they were adopted. They are the ones that proved, again and again, that when everything else starts coming apart, they still work.